All right. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the spring presentation of this year's Distinguished Environmental Speaker Series here at Widener University. I'm John Dernbach. I direct the Environmental Law and Sustainability Center here at Widener Commonwealth Law School. We have two audiences today, our live audience in Harrisburg and our live audience via teleconference to our sister school in Delaware, I think. I don't see anybody there, though. So we'll see how that goes. A lot of the usual suspects in Delaware are at a conference at Northwest University in South Africa on environmental constitutional law. And so if we don't have anybody from Delaware, that would be the reason why. This is the fifth year of our speaker series. We've made a point of inviting highly qualified speakers from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives. And our speaker today is Emily Hammond. She's the Associate Dean for Public Engagement, which sounds like a really interesting job to me, and Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C. She's a nationally recognized expert in energy law, environmental law, and administrative law. She's a former environmental engineer, and she brings technical fluency to cutting-edge issues at the intersection of law, science, and policy. She's a leading authority on nuclear energy markets, regulatory jurisdiction, and various responses of legal institutions to scientific uncertainty. She's published articles in a variety of top-ranked journals, is the co-author of the nation's leading energy law text, and also a co-author of an environmental law text, among other things. She's an elected member of the American Law Institute, and also chair-elect of the American Association of American Law Schools Administrative Law Section, and a member of the scholar of the Center for Progressive Reform. Before she joined the GW faculty, she served at the faculties at Wake Forest and the University of Oklahoma, where she won numerous teaching awards and served as Associate Dean. Before entering academia, she practiced law with a firm in Atlanta and clerked for a federal judge in Georgia. She's a graduate of Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University and the University of Georgia Law School. She'll be speaking today on the subject of climate change and the limits of administrative law. The way we're going to proceed is she's going to speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. Please welcome Emily Hammond.
Thank you, and thank you, John, for having me, and Sandy as well. Sandy may be out there, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And just from meeting some of you already, I can tell that you're a sophisticated group. So please feel free to pause if there's anything that you want to ask about as I go, but I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. The topic of the paper, or the presentation today, is really looking at two things. First of all, with the Clean Power Plan, we are seeing some changes. Historically, environmental law has been very media specific. So it's been specifically about air, about water, about the particular resource. But modern energy law has really had its origins in ensuring that prices are just and reasonable. So it's a very economic form of regulation. Increasingly, though, we're seeing, at least on the environmental side, a better integration of energy. At the same time, from the electric side, we have a tension between electricity regulation, which is directed at making markets more efficient, and this desire to green the grid. So I'll start with the proposition that the Clean Power Plan, under the Clean Air Act, has integrated into the law of air emissions the realities of the electric grid in a way that we have not seen before, and in a very important way, just as a policy matter. But I'd also like to show the mismatch between that and the law of electricity markets, which really simply does not value environmental attributes of the various electricity fuels. So what I'll be doing is, first of all, just giving a brief overview of the Clean Power Plan. I know many of you are already very familiar with that. And then I'll talk about this electricity market mismatch. It values cost. It doesn't value environmental attributes. It values reliability somewhat, but not to a full extent. I'll talk about some potential policy responses, and then really I'll look forward to the discussion that you all bring. So, Clean Air Act. Again, broad overview. Many of you are familiar with this. It's generally divided into two big categories. One of those is mobile sources, like motor vehicles, and one is stationary sources, like power plants. EPA and NHTSA do regulate greenhouse gas emissions from mobile sources. That's after the Massachusetts versus EPA decision. Stationary sources have lagged a bit, but what we have for stationary sources are three key parts of the Clean Air Act. First of all are the criteria pollutants, things like particulate matter, things like nitrogen oxides. All right, EPA sets those national criteria, and then the states implement them. Hazardous pollutants like mercury, all right, that's Section 112 of the Clean Air Act. There, EPA sets standards by source category. So specifically, for example, for electric generating units, which has been up to the Supreme Court lately, and then states implement those. And then there's a provision for new sources. This is Section 111, which is where the authority for the Clean Power Plan exists. So this is the focus for the Clean Power Plan. And I'll just give you an overview of the scheme. I should mention, I'm sure many of you know that the litigation over the Clean Power Plan is pending in the D.C. Circuit. The Supreme Court has stayed the plan during the pendency of the litigation. I'm not going to focus very much on those legal arguments for and against the Clean Power Plan. I'm going to take it as a given because I think, at least for our purposes today, the point is that the Clean Power Plan has tried to make a closer connection between how the grid works and environmental values, and particularly climate change. So just as a very basic overview, all right, Section 111B of the Clean Air Act says that EPA should set new source performance standards, all right, and these are baseline requirements. They go by industrial category, and this is for pollutants that endanger the public health. All right, greenhouse gas emissions, the EPA has found endanger public health. All right, EPA sets these standards, not the states. But once EPA sets those standards for new sources, then the states are obligated to set standards for existing sources. All right, they have to use the best system of emission reduction, BSER is what I'll call it going forward. And this provision is understood as a gap filler. It works with the criteria pollutants and the hazardous air pollutants sections of the statute in the sense that it's a gap filler. All right, it's meant to regulate pollutants that aren't otherwise part of those two other components of the statute. All right, so what about BSER? Well, I will make this point about the pending litigation. EPA did something new with the Clean Air Act. Traditionally, it has looked at this kind of language as imposing technology-specific standards. Imagine putting a scrubber on a single smokestack, all right? But for the Clean Power Plan, EPA said, no, we're focusing on a system, and the entire electric grid is that system. So if you hear the language beyond the fence line, there's my fence around, actually, I think that's a refinery. But the point is, EPA said best systems of emission reduction is going to be judged outside the fence line of an individual power plant and in a way that considers how the entire grid is integrated. All right, so how was BSER developed? First of all, just in case you're not familiar with it, EPA's projection under the Clean Power Plan is that emissions will be 20% less than 2012 levels by 2030. All right, the power plan sets goals for states, and states can choose which approach to take. They can do it pounds per megawatt hour, they can do it tons per year. Those two top ones are for existing sources. Oh, I think I have a pointer here. I'm not sure I trust this to point, so I'm going to leave it alone. And then there's this idea of doing a mass-based approach that also includes new sources. All right, so pros and cons to each of those depending on your perspective. But what I'd like to focus on are how the EPA set up targets for the states. It took this building block approach. All right, the first one is let's increase the efficiency of existing coal-fired power plants. All right, there's not a lot of room for those kinds of increases, but there's a little bit. So it said we're going to do that first. Next, we want to have a switch from coal to natural gas. All right, as much as possible. Natural gas is a fossil fuel, but it emits quite a bit less carbon dioxide than coal-fired power. And then EPA says, finally, we're going to add in new low-carbon sources. Renewable energy primarily is what it's focused on here. States are supposed to make these implementation plans. If states don't do that, then EPA has proposed a federal plan. The comment period has closed for that, so we'll see what it says soon enough, I think, in response to comments. All right, well, what about reliability? One of the concerns that's been raised about the Clean Power Plan is that if we put that many variable sources of electricity, all right, onto the grid, will there be blackouts? Can the grid handle that level of renewable penetration? I'll say a few more words about why this is an issue in a few moments, but here's what EPA says. No, this is going to work because the grid is a large interconnected system. All right, if the wind stops blowing over in this state, well, the sun will be shining in that state, all right, and we'll be able to keep supply and demand in balance because of this system. All right, so let's turn to the system. This is the integration of this idea of the grid and all of the resources on the grid working together in the Clean Power Plan. Here is the grid. Those are the main large transmission lines across the U.S. All right. In terms of managing the grid, we have three major interconnections, East, West, and Texas. And I'm happy to talk more about Texas. It's a bit unique, but it seeks to avoid federal jurisdiction by keeping to itself. All right. The grid is operated in such a way that supply and demand are always kept in balance. So we have dispatch centers, all right, that are constantly making sure that we have energy going to where the loads are, and they have to keep that in balance. And if they don't, we do have blackouts, brownouts, and other problems. By the way, Power Grid is a fun game you can play. My 10-year-old consistently beats me at it. All right. So in thinking about attributes of electricity, I think there's three things we ought to be thinking about. First of all is minimizing cost. Ratepayers don't want to pay a lot, and we should want economic efficiency. Maximizing not just reliability, but also flexibility. And the reason I use that word flexibility is to capture the idea that a full complement of different types of electricity fuels can help the grid be more resilient. And then minimizing environmental externalities. Obviously, you can't do all of these at an optimum level all at once. But I think that these three variables are what we should be thinking about in terms of what we would like our grid to do. So, reliability and flexibility, this is simply the point I made otherwise, balancing those loads, at the same time trying to keep prices low. Let me say a few words about cost. This slide is based on data from the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, and it covers levelized cost of electricity. What this is, and the LCOE column is the one to look at least for now, this is the today's dollars cost of each of these kinds of power plants over their lifetime, all right, per megawatt hour. So there are tons of assumptions going into these numbers. I can point you to the EIA list of assumptions, and they are definitely imperfect and subject to criticism. the reason I put them up here is because I think from a relative perspective, it helps give a feel for the cost attribute of some of these resources. All right, so you can see here in terms of dollars per megawatt hour, why people like to build natural gas right now. If you want to break that down a little further, the capital costs as a percent of levelized cost tell you a lot about how long it takes to build one of these plants and what the cost of capital is, how much it costs to borrow money to build them. All right, so for example, look at nuclear. Its capital costs are a very high percent of its overall lifetime costs. All right, they take a very long time to build, and it's very expensive to get financing for them. All right, you can see natural gas takes a shorter time to build, and investors are not scared of natural gas. The coal number is a little bit higher than it has been in the past to reflect that investors are more uncertain about building new coal-fired plants given the regulatory climate and where market forces seem to be headed. I'd also like to point out this variable O&M. Operation and maintenance is O&M, but this also covers fuel costs. So if you think about those numbers in that right-hand column, notice that the renewables are zero. You don't have to pay anything once you have them installed for them to generate electricity. Right? There are no fuel costs for sun or for wind. Nuclear is very, very low because it's refueled every 18 months or so, and it's actually not that expensive. You can see that natural gas has quite a bit of variability, and then coal is essentially, we're talking about the cost of the actual coal. So it's just kind of interesting, I think, to look at this and see that once you've built the plant, you're going to have quite a bit of difference in that variable cost going forward and a cost associated with generating electricity. All right. So to further understand how cost relates, I'm going to map onto this technical grid that transmits power the wholesale electric markets. All right, so wholesale electricity, this is electricity that is purchased and sold for resale. So we're not talking about the retail side, what you and I as customers are buying. We're talking about the big bulk purchases and sales of power that happen at the wholesale level. Here in Pennsylvania, this is mostly done by PJM, the PJM interconnection. A little bit is MISO, which is that blue-gray one that stretches all the way up into Canada. But these are operators of organized markets. These are spot or day-ahead transactions. Right? People bid, offers to sell, and offers to buy based on the short-run marginal cost of the power. Right? What this means is the cost of generating the next increment of power. So imagine that you're a coal-fired power plant. Your plant is already running. You don't have to power it up. And you have a pile of coal. It's the cost of that pile of coal that is needed to make the next megawatt hour that is your short-run marginal cost. Okay. And then power is dispatched to meet demand as it arises from the lowest to the highest cost, right? Constrained by the technical needs of the grid. And I should say also somewhat by the technical needs of the power source itself. All right, so let's look at that in a little bit more detail. This is a basic snapshot of our electricity fuels. This is a 2015 report from EIA, but it uses 2013 numbers. So you can see here, coal is the lion's share. Natural gas has been increasing with the low prices. All right, you can see that renewables also have increased over time. All right, there's nuclear at 19%, and we do have petroleum and other liquids. So that's an overall snapshot of what goes into electricity nationally. But let's talk about the specifics of each fuel source. I'll start with base load. This is the power that is needed to always be on. All right. Always at any given point in time in the day or night, there is a minimum level of power that is just needed from all of the different kinds of uses that you can imagine. So this is electricity at a constant rate that's always taking place. And the plants that are best suited for this are the ones that can't cycle up and down easily. Nuclear. Nuclear always needs to run. All right, so it is one of the major suppliers of baseload power. All right, in fact, it only supplies baseload power because it's just always running. All right, coal is also a major supplier of baseload power because those boilers do very poorly as well if they cycle up and down. It's very inefficient and expensive to do that, and by the way, it also pollutes more when you do that. All right, so this is our baseload. This is the power that's always on. Then we have intermediate loads. So as demand increases, let's say throughout the day, all right, we need other power sources to come online. Typically, these are going to be smaller coal-fired power plants, maybe some that are a little bit less efficient to run but can be put on and dispatched to the grid, as well as natural gas. Natural gas, at least some of the natural gas plants, turn on and off. They have jet engines in them, essentially. And so they can be turned off and on much more easily than coal. Then we have peaking plants. So this is when the need for electricity spikes. Think the middle of the summer at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody's air conditioners come on. Typically, this is natural gas plants. They call them peaking plants. And some hydro also can be operated this way. And then I'll shift over now to the variable resources, the renewables. The marginal costs are so low, as I said before. Remember, fuel costs zero. So they tend to be dispatched to the grid whenever they're running. When they stop producing, when the wind stops blowing and the sun stops shining, other resources have to be available very quickly to balance that drop in power, to balance the load. And so this variability is one of the concerns of opponents of the Clean Power Plan, who worry that if we have too many renewables online, we won't have enough other resources to balance major drops in the load that's being produced. All right, let me just give you an example of how this stuff is dispatched with a different chart here. So if you look at this, the numbers 1 through 24 correspond to the hours of a day. And you can see there nuclear is the base load. It is always running. Okay. Hydro base load, much hydro is always running as well. Then we have some flexible. A state might import power. I think Pennsylvania actually exports it, but I think some of you can tell me about that for sure. And then we have different kinds of gas that may come online. And then you see the peaking plants up above. Notice, too, where the renewables fit. All right. They're coming in regardless of what the price is on the market because they're always just feeding into the grid when they're running. The numbers here correspond to the market clearing price at a given time. And what you can see is that as demand peaks, the cost also peaks. And so we're dispatching the cheaper sources of power first and going up to the top. The key thing to understand about the market here, the clearing price, which is going to be the price at any given time of day, is the price that everybody gets. All right, so just for example, if we're at that 27 megawatt hours and that gas combined cycle number 3 is the one that pushed up to that price, all of the sources below it under this curve will also get that amount of money for their generation. So, what about the environmental externalities? They're not at all considered in this dispatch stack. All right, but, and I know you all are familiar with these, I'll just go through just a few of them. Obviously, we have the air emissions, fossil fuels, not just greenhouse gases, but those criteria pollutants and those hazardous pollutants that I mentioned. Solid waste, particularly a problem with coal and with nuclear power. We also have water use externalities associated with coal, nuclear, and some natural gas. And this leaves off the production externalities that happen with all of the different fuel sources too. So here I'm focusing on what happens at the power plant, but obviously there are a lot more to be considered. So just to kind of summarize, we end up with an interesting profile if we take a look at all of these different fuel sources and look at their attributes. Some of them are flexible. They can be ramped up and down like natural gas. You can see that the externalities obviously line up with the renewables at best. Differences in capital cost and differences in operating cost. Notice that none of these is perfect. If you're thinking about cost, reliability and flexibility, and environmental values, there are trade-offs associated with all of these different fuel sources. But the markets only really pay attention to cost. Here's my joke. Okay. So let me come back to this idea of reliability and the environment. We do have some constraints for reliability. Certainly the type of power supply that's available is going to somewhat constrain what's dispatched and its ability to step in. But the environmental aspects of any of these fuel sources is really covered in different ways. It's covered by environmental law. So for example, if you do have a scrubber on your power plant, that increases your long-term average costs. Not necessarily your short-run marginal costs, but your long-term costs. Things like renewable portfolio standards or production tax credits do enable those resources to bid at lower levels, all right, because they can make more money from their tax credits, for example. But really, these spot markets are designed just to consider short-run marginal cost. All right. So what happens for plant profitability here? Sometimes competitive bids aren't dispatched because of the grid itself. Some other factors might lower market clearing prices. But one of the keys for these spot markets is that a plant can't earn a positive return on its investment over time, all right, unless those market clearing prices exceed the long-run average costs. All right, I'll demonstrate what happens here with nuclear power. I suspect that saying nuclear power elicits strong responses probably in either direction. So let me just acknowledge that right off the bat. But I think nuclear power is a great example of a fuel source that's very interesting. It does not emit greenhouse gases. It does have the spent nuclear fuel, nuclear waste issue. It's something that evokes very strong responses in people, but at the same time, it's a very highly regulated and self-contained industry. So it makes a nice illustration of some of these flaws in the market. It's a very reliable source of power. Environmentally, at least from the generation side, it's quite clean, but you probably have heard in the news that it's struggling to survive in these competitive markets. All right. Those are the points I just made. So let me talk a little bit about the licensing regime. And this is to make the point that I think that nuclear does internalize a lot of what other power sources still externalize. The licensing regime is incredibly complex and thorough. Consider, for example, that the standard for the safety aspects of nuclear power is adequate protection, which does not include cost. So very often you see cost-benefit analysis going on for other kinds of power plants, not for nuclear. The safety part does not consider cost. The nuclear industry has to establish a trust fund to decommission plants. All right, so thinking maybe 60 years, 100 years into the future, they have to be paying into a trust fund to clean up that site one day when the power plant closes. That's a very, very rare thing to see with other types of plants. They have to pay lots of money for spent fuel handling and disposal. We've seen some of the examples with coal ash, but that's not necessarily true for other sources of power. They are constantly replacing parts, doing upgrades, backfitting the plants in response to things like Fukushima, and they must carry insurance. So there are a lot of costs that nuclear internalizes that other plants don't. But in terms of competing in the markets, they do have those short-run marginal costs. Remember, that was a low number because the fuel is relatively cheap. The problem for nuclear is it always has to be running. All right? So it takes whatever price the market clears at. It does not really get a choice in terms of bidding in and saying, I will sell at this price. It just takes what the market clearing price is. And because of all of those other regulatory costs, nuclear's long-run average costs are quite high, and so the short-run marginal cost of the market clearing price often doesn't cover those long-run average costs. So I give this example really to just demonstrate an interesting source of power that has some good environmental attributes, some good reliability, but actually isn't functioning very well in these competitive markets because of the way the markets are structured. So how about valuing the environment? And here I'll kind of bring it out more broadly because I think these considerations could be used with any of the cleaner fuel sources. One possibility is maybe FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, should somehow account for environmental attributes in the way power is dispatched. So FERC has the jurisdictional authority over these markets. It approves the market rules that, say, PJM proposes. And so one possibility is, well, maybe they could have a carbon adder. Maybe we could make it more expensive for the carbon-emitting fuel sources to actually participate in those markets. I have some colleagues who have argued that FERC does have authority under its existing statutory mandates to do that, but it would be a stretch. And just as a political matter, it's probably unlikely that FERC would go that far out on a limb. It has such a long tradition of regulating the economic aspects of markets from a sort of traditional standard of what that means. But the counter-argument is, well, you could say that a fuel source that emits carbon and doesn't have to pay for its emission of carbon is causing those markets to be unjust and reasonable. So there is an argument there, I think a tough one. It seems like we have headed, especially with the Clean Power Plan, to the next best type of solution, which is to change the economics of the inputs to the market. So we're not changing the market rules. It's still dispatched on short-run marginal cost, but if we change the inputs, those short-run marginal cost numbers ought to be different. So for example, if we taxed pollution, then a coal-fired power plant, for example, would have to make a higher bid into the market to be able to recoup its costs. If we had marketable permits, we'd have a similar effect. One problem, this is where I just came from, it wasn't gridlock yet, but politically it is. So it's also very difficult to think about solutions at the federal level that really do much more than what we've seen with the Clean Power Plan. Certainly with Congress stepping in, it seems very unlikely. Which brings me to some of the state possibilities. All right, you all I know are familiar with these, the renewable portfolio standards that many states have. Others are looking at a little bit broader clean energy fuel standards. This is happening in many of the states that are looking for ways to preserve their existing nuclear power plants. Integrated resources planning is a process that's been around since the 70s for states. And the idea is that if you would like to build a new power plant in a state, you have to do some kind of cost-benefit analysis to show that that plant is justified. Some states have really taken that method of looking at things that go beyond just costs in the traditional sense to also consider sustainability type values or environmental type values, perhaps doing things like efficiency rather than building that next power plant. And so that is an area that states have gone in. One of the things that I think is interesting to be watching, and I'm watching it in Pennsylvania and hope you all will share some experiences, is Clean Power Plan compliance. We said states have to create these plans. They have to be approved by EPA, but right now, the Clean Power Plan has stayed. So what are states doing? Some of them, like Pennsylvania, have said, we're going to still proceed with the listening sessions, with the planning. We're going to map out how we would like to comply. And so one thing that's interesting for states to think about is, okay, let's think about an approach that works for our state, regardless of whether the Clean Power Plan exists. All right. It does have, I think, some legal vulnerabilities. This is not to say it will fail, but it could. But many states seem to be saying the market is leading us in the direction toward greener fuel sources. All right, we know that these competitive markets don't value that, but we have an independent value for the environmental attributes of our fuel sources. And so states are looking at more robust efficiency planning, different methods of incentivizing renewables. Others are looking at interesting methods of incentivizing new nuclear or new natural gas. I'll just come back here. One thing to be a little bit cautious about is preemption, and I can say some words about that in the comments if you all would like, but states do have to be sure not to run afoul of preemption under the Federal Power Act and looking at options. Regional initiatives, these generally still would have to be approved by FERC, but if they came from the regions, they're more likely to survive FERC review than if FERC just created them. Regional greenhouse gas initiatives, we certainly have a few of those. Some of these regions are actually working on enhanced reliability standards. Capacity markets, it's a future market for future capacity. PJM has done some innovative things there to allow, for example, demand response, which is a promise not to use electricity to be bid into those markets. And then there's the idea of social cost dispatch. This has been around for a long time, but as we think about ways to green the grid in the future, thinking about how to better capture all of the costs of electricity sources has made people start talking about this again. I think the bottom line, just to come back to the initial point, which is the Clean Power Plan is important regardless of whether it survives a legal challenge because of the policy statement that it makes. Because it shows this push toward understanding that we have a big interconnected grid, all right, the resources on it work together in different ways to either promote environmental values or actually act to the detriment of the environment. And seeing that acknowledged at the federal level, I think is a very important policy initiative. We do have a long ways to go on the traditional electricity regulation side. You can see it's ingrained, it's very much based on these economic principles, and it's really hard to undo those. I think we should keep trying, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to work on. And with that, I'll close, and I would love to hear your comments and questions and your experiences, particularly here in the state. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. Let's see, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
There we go.
Okay. So I have drafted Stacy Lindsay to be the official microphone person. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and Stacy will bring you the microphone.
Hi, I'm sorry. I came in late, so you may have covered this in the first 15 minutes or so. What part do individuals have to play in the power generation scheme eventually, in terms of people putting things on the roofs of their houses, putting their houses underground, putting windmills in their backyard, doing passive solar heating of water and such like?
Oh, I think individuals play a huge role. The talk hasn't really covered a lot of those kinds of initiatives. But I can tell you, I think they're an incredibly important part of the mix. Do you have a follow?
Yes. Are there administrative barriers and state barriers to people? Right. Okay. Could you tell us a little bit about those barriers?
Sure. So, for example, I have solar panels on my house. That's called distributed generation. It's and one of the issues, and I understand this is playing out here too, is how should I be compensated when I produce more power than I use, and that power goes back into the grid? So some states allow net metering, which, at least for me in Virginia currently, basically means my meter runs backwards. So I get the retail rate, and it's always a fixed retail rate. There's no time of use change, anything like that. It's very simple. But some states are requiring, for example, a charge if you're connected to the grid, if you expect to have power available to you when your solar panels are not generating, then many utilities have made the case that there should be some cost associated with that, that consumers should pay. The amount that they should pay right now seems to be fairly arbitrary. There is some work being done on trying to actually quantify costs and benefits, because certainly distributed generation provides benefits to the grid as well as costs to the grid. So that's just one of the issues. Another one is demand response at the consumer level. And so here, what I'm talking about is we, the consumers, would be getting price signals. If our power were actually varying in cost, depending on the time of day and how that dispatch stack looked, we could modify our behavior based on those signals. We might decide to reduce our demand for electricity at the times of high cost, use our electricity instead at other times. Now, one possibility is that simply shifts load, right? We're still using electricity just at different times, but some of the pilot projects that have explored demand response and using a smart grid to facilitate that have found that consumers actually reduced their overall use as well. So that's a way to both save money and to use less power at the consumer level, but it depends very heavily on supportive state policies. And there's all kinds of variation on that. So just a couple of examples. Right. So zoning restrictions, land use restrictions are also a big issue. Some localities are doing other things. So again, I'll use my own example. I'm in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, which provides a tax break for the first 5 years after which you install solar panels. So for example, theoretically it increases the value of my house. They don't start charging me for that increased value until 5 years later. So it's a small tax break over the first 5 years. So there are beneficial ways that local governments can support renewable energy or efficiency measures, as well as the ones that keep them out. Yeah.
You talked about supply and demand, but in terms of supply, in order to avoid blackouts and brownouts, there should be some excess electricity being generated. Right. And is there any prospect of large-scale storage of that surplus electricity such that you can drop the peak load, the peaking dispatch that you described?
People are working hard on it. It's just not cheap enough yet at the kind of scale that would make a huge impact. But my goodness, it is sure to be. I don't know when, but I'm very confident that we will have a lot of improvement in storage.
Yeah, I also had a question touching on the reliability issue and the failure of the current market to price in the risks. Right now we have this interesting alignment where gas-fired power plants are getting capacity payments to be available. Now, they sell their electricity on the spot market. They would be getting contracts for gas transmission on like 10-year take-or-pay contracts, and they're not doing it.
Right.
So the fired power plants don't have firm commitments for fuel.
Right.
If we had a situation like the polar vortex again, now that gas has taken over for coal on the PJM grid as the supplier, they just simply don't have the ability to guarantee availability.
That's a huge issue. And so just to maybe, I mean, I think you've described it quite well. But basically, natural gas relies on pipelines to get the gas to those power plants. They are selling on the spot market the electricity rather than using long-term contracts. And what this means is without long-term contracts in place, investors have been reluctant to invest in the natural gas transmission infrastructure to ensure the kind of supply we would need if everybody needed electricity and home heating all at the, or not just home heating, industrial heating as well, all at the same time. Right, but the issue is we have insufficient levels of investment in the pipeline infrastructure because of the lack of those long-term contracts, because natural gas has also gone to spot markets.
Rob, if I can, everybody in the room can hear you. We're recording this. So if you want to
So I will say, so in PJM, in our regional transmission organization, PJM has done some work on this issue in not these spot markets that the energy markets I've been talking about, but those capacity markets. So there you have power generators promising to have available electricity generation 3 years in the future. All right. And so the idea is that can help investors understand what's needed in terms of whether to build new generation. But PJM has attached penalties. If you promise to have that generation available in the future, natural gas plant, and you don't, then there's a stick attached. So that's one of the ways PJM is trying to address that issue. But I think there are a lot of other issues at that natural gas electricity nexus that do still need to be addressed.
other questions?
A very microeconomics question. Referring to your stack diagram, if we all used electricity on the off hours, we never used our dishwasher from say 3 to 8 o'clock at night. We never washed our clothes, dried our clothes, turned all our lights off. We would come down on that stack.
That's right.
And consumers could expect a lower cost.
Yes.
Even though, like in the olden days, like I could sign up with my utility and get that. Like if I agreed, that I could get a tiered rate. My off hours were this much, my peak hours were that much. That was like 20 years ago. Now when they do it, there's a penalty for using electricity peak rate. Like if you go over so much, then you get a penalty. Well, no one's going to take a penalty, right? So that essentially no one does that anymore. But even if you act, even there's no written contract for that off-peak for that peak level reduction, if you act like there is, we all really get it.
So I guess
If we act like we're getting
distinguish between the wholesale price and the retail price. So the wholesale price is a piece of our retail price.
right,
And
you
so
don't get right.
that's the amount that will be reduced, all right, to
Right, the transmission fee
to the
won't
utility.
change, all those other things change, but that
Sure.
whatever.
So that's reduced to the utility that purchases the power and then sells it to the retail customers. The retail price is going to be a function of state law and how that's structured and like what you're describing. So it's up
It's
to the
worse-
state regulator to ensure that that lower wholesale price gets reflected in the consumer's bill.
I believe it's actually worse in Pennsylvania, and that whatever that peak price is, consumers pay that all year. I think that's how it is. Someone could correct me on that, but the last time I looked into it, that was so. So if you get that peak in July 17th, you actually pay that price all year. That's ridiculous, but anyway.
Thanks.
You described a regime there for the regional grids like PJM. There's lease cost dispatching, where the plant that can bid in at the lowest cost gets to deliver electricity. Some years ago, there was a concept of lease pollution dispatching. What happened to that, and why is that not viable in the current market?
Yeah, this is what I would put in the category of social cost dispatch there in the bottom. So accounting for things like pollution in the cost, it hasn't been politically viable. That's my best understanding of why people haven't done it, because the economists who designed these electric markets for various reasons, some policy and some from their view of economics, don't want to include that, and policymakers have not had the political motivation to do it. So there are a number of economists who have demonstrated how to do it. You certainly have the analysis and the math there. And in fact, I have a paper that cites those studies that show that it's doable. But it's really a matter of political will. So.
How well does the Clean Power Plan, in going beyond the fence line, how well does it go back to the production side to account for? So, for example, when it's trying to incentivize switches from coal to natural gas, does it account for methane leakage and all of the greenhouse impacts? For basically all phases of production,
right,
for all sources of energy.
It does not do that. And my understanding of EPA's approach has been to look more piecemeal at the life cycle aspects of these different fuel sources. So, for example, methane leakage is addressed, but not under the Clean Power Plan. So, you have to report it. I think there's a proposed rule for regulating it right now. But it's not itself captured in the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan is really contemplating what comes out of the smokestack, if there is one. And it doesn't, it sets goals for states based on the existing resource mix in a state and based on these assumptions, but it leaves to the states to decide what to actually regulate and how. So it's up to the states to say, we want to do this or that with our particular fuel mix, or with non-generation assets like efficiency or demand response to get to those targets. So there's assumptions that EPA used in deciding what the state's targets would be, but then in terms of actually deciding how to meet the targets, that's state policy. So another one.
Can you hold on a second?
You're here in Harrisburg, sort of in the unique location where we have 6 nuclear power units on our river, on our Susquehanna, which import a huge thermal load to the river, and we see fish kills and things like that here. That wasn't included in your environmental cost of nuclear power plants. And I think you may have answered that previously by saying that, that's not a political will. There's no way to monetize that, but I would think that is a huge environmental cost.
So this kind of goes to the natural gas question, which is that is an environmental cost, and so is dealing with the spent fuel. So again, talking about what comes out of the smokestack, but there again we have different laws that aren't germane to the Clean Power Plan, to deal with the thermal discharge. The Clean Water Act is where you have to go for that. And, I think many people agree that our existing environmental laws don't do enough to minimize those externalities. That's why, again, the market doesn't capture that at all. Yeah.
Thank you for your patience. I am very curious. Have there been any economic forecasts or estimates as to how much energy could be generated outside of the traditional power plant system, and what that would do to the existing power grid and the economics of power, and without regard for whether people are willing to do it? Let's assume that everybody has lots of money and wants to put solar panels on their house.
Right. I believe there have been those studies. I don't have numbers to tell you, but I feel quite certain that a number of different organizations have tried to make those kinds of estimates. Honestly, and this is where sort of my interest in looking at how science is used for policy comes into play. Depending on which organization is making those estimates, you'll have those results pointing in different ways. The industry groups that make those estimates say this will crash the grid. It probably won't, but it may require that the grid looks different than it does now. Environmental interest groups say, of course we can do it and there's no problem. Obviously, those are, when you're making such predictions and making so many assumptions, the various studies are very sensitive to the assumptions going into them. But it does seem like if we were able to get everybody using solar and doing those energy efficiency measures, it could be a huge beneficial impact in terms of pollution. So I think you just have to be careful to look at the source to decide what you want to rely on.
Okay, what I'm thinking about is you may recall that 20 years ago we didn't have any cell phones. And then the cell phone industry was born, and people wanted to put up cell phone towers in towns and cities, and people who were concerned about radiation frying their brains rose up and prevented certain things from happening. And I think the cell phone industry, the telecommunications industry, then caused legislation to be passed at the national level, which basically said, sorry, you can't prevent this erection in your neighborhood.
That's right.
What is your estimation that the standardized power industry will take such action to prevent people from being able to put up wind power generators, and such like?
Well, I think you see it with solar happening at the state level already. So I think at the state level we're seeing utilities, convincing state legislatures to pass statutes that make it much more difficult, or certainly take away the economic incentives for distributed generation, for consumer level solar panels. So I think we're certainly seeing that in some of the states. At the federal level, the utility industry is very strong, but the renewables industry is also quite strong. And so I think you have quite a bit of push-pull there. And I mean, honestly, the deadlock is what's sort of the norm right now. So I don't think we could see Congress stepping in right now and prohibiting states from discriminating against renewables. All right, I don't see that happening the way it happened with the cell towers. Okay, but I also wouldn't necessarily think that we would see Congress stepping in and saying, squelching all renewables in favor of traditional power generation. So there's just not movement there. I mean, I do think that the movement we'll see is at the state and federal regulatory levels within the agencies. And so there, the administration becomes very important. The next president becomes very important. So.
Other questions? Going once? Going twice? Going three times? Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.